November 1983. NATO headquarters transmitted encrypted orders across Western Europe, standard military exercise protocols, routine procedures. Except this time, Soviet intelligence detected something different, something that matched every indicator in their nuclear first strike checklist. What happened next brought the world closer to thermonuclear war than any moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and most people still don't know it almost happened. The year 1983 represented the most dangerous period in superpower relations since the Berlin Crisis of 1961, a convergence of strategic miscalculations, intelligence failures, and ideological paranoia that created conditions where a military exercise could trigger global annihilation. Ronald Reagan had entered his third year as President of the United States, pursuing a military buildup unprecedented in peacetime and rhetoric that Soviet leadership interpreted not as political posturing, but as genuine preparation for nuclear war, including his March speech labeling the Soviet Union an evil empire and his March 23 announcement of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which Moscow viewed as an attempt to achieve first strike capability by neutralizing their retaliatory deterrent. The Kremlin leadership, dominated by aging hardliners who remembered the Nazi invasion and viewed American intentions through that historical lens, had spent the previous 2 years convinced that the United States was preparing a surprise nuclear attack, a conviction that led to the implementation of Operation Ryan, a massive intelligence collection effort specifically designed to detect indicators of Western preparations for a first strike. NATO's conventional military superiority in Western Europe, combined with the recent deployment of Pershing II missiles in West Germany, which could reach Moscow in 6 to 8 minutes, compared to the 30-minute warning time provided by intercontinental ballistic missiles, had fundamentally altered Soviet strategic calculations and created a situation where Moscow believed it would have almost no time to respond to an American attack. The Soviet intelligence apparatus, operating under intense pressure from General Secretary Yuri Andropov to detect signs of Western aggression, had developed a specific list of indicators that would supposedly reveal preparations for a nuclear first strike, including unusual patterns in NATO communications, changes in military readiness levels, activation of reserve forces, and the execution of command post exercises that simulated nuclear release procedures. These indicators, compiled in a directive distributed to KGB and GRU stations across Western Europe and North America, reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how NATO actually operated and a tendency to mirror-image Soviet procedures onto Western military practices, assuming that the United States and its allies would prepare for nuclear war in the same methodical, centralized manner that Soviet doctrine prescribed. The list included movements of government officials to secure locations, blood bank mobilization, increased signals intelligence activity, and changes in the operating procedures of NATO command and control systems, each indicator weighted and evaluated to determine whether Western actions constituted normal activity or preparation for war. Intelligence analysts in Moscow had been trained to look for these specific patterns, creating a cognitive framework that made them hypersensitive to anything that might confirm their pre-existing belief that the United States was planning an attack, a classic example of confirmation bias operating at the strategic level, where the stakes involved the potential deaths of hundreds of millions of people. The annual NATO command post exercises, conducted regularly since the formation of the alliance, typically followed predictable patterns that Soviet intelligence had observed and catalogued for decades, involving the transmission of exercise messages, the activation of alternate command centers, and the simulation of defensive responses to Warsaw Pact aggression that never included the full sequence of procedures that would precede an actual nuclear strike. Able Archer 83, scheduled to begin on November 2nd and conclude on November 11th, appeared on the NATO exercise calendar, like dozens of similar exercises that had occurred throughout the Cold War, another routine training event designed to test command and control procedures and ensure that alliance military forces could coordinate effectively in a crisis. Soviet intelligence officers monitoring NATO communications networks during the first days of November detected standard exercise traffic, encrypted messages moving between Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe in Belgium, and subordinate commands across the continent, Nothing that immediately suggested this exercise would differ significantly from previous years. The exercise scenario, classified at the time and not fully revealed until decades later when documents were declassified, postulated a period of rising tensions in Europe, followed by conventional Warsaw Pact attacks across the inner German border, a standard Cold War premise that had formed the basis for countless NATO planning exercises and war games. Participating units would simulate the movement of forces, the activation of reserve components, and the execution of defensive operations designed to blunt a Soviet offensive, while NATO political leadership worked through a series of decision points that would determine the alliance response. Saussure, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, would coordinate defensive operations from his headquarters, while maintaining communication with national capitals and the North Atlantic Council, following established procedures that had been refined through years of exercises and updated to reflect lessons learned from previous training events and changes in NATO strategy. But Able Archer 83 included modifications to standard procedures that Soviet intelligence had never observed before. The exercise would simulate the full escalation ladder from conventional conflict through tactical nuclear release, and finally, to strategic nuclear exchange. For the first time, the exercise would include the participation of heads of government in the simulation, with British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, US Vice President George H.W. Bush, and West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl playing their actual wartime roles rather than having staff officers stand in for political leadership. NATO would activate reforger procedures, simulating the reinforcement of Europe from the United States, and would shift to minimize communications protocols, reducing routine message traffic while increasing the volume of encrypted high-priority transmissions. The exercise would test new authentication procedures for nuclear release orders, implement radio silence protocols, and simulate the dispersal of tactical nuclear weapons from storage sites to forward deployment locations. Command posts would relocate to alternate facilities. The distinctive NATO communications pattern that Soviet signals intelligence had monitored for decades would change. NATO planners designed these modifications to make Able Archer 83 the most realistic exercise in the alliance's history, testing procedures and decision-making processes under conditions that closely approximated actual war, pushing systems and people to operate under stress and ambiguity, to identify weaknesses that could be corrected before a real crisis occurred. The exercise directors focused on training objectives and the need to validate recent changes to NATO nuclear procedures, saw nothing dangerous about making the simulation more realistic. They operated within a Western military culture that clearly distinguished between exercises and actual operations, where multiple safety checks and communication protocols ensured that no one could mistake training for war, and where the concept of a surprise nuclear attack launched under cover of an exercise seemed absurd, because Western democratic systems could not organize such an attack without generating political signals that would be impossible to hide. But Soviet intelligence analysts, operating within a different cultural and organizational context, where maskirovka, military deception designed to hide true intentions, was a fundamental principle of operations, viewed realistic exercises as potential covers for actual attack preparations, and the modifications to Able Archer 83 matched almost perfectly with the indicators that Moscow had identified as precursors to nuclear war. Soviet early warning radars and signals intelligence stations began detecting anomalies on November 2nd. NATO communications networks shifted to wartime configurations. Message traffic volumes increased, encryption patterns changed. Radio silence protocols went into effect across sectors. Commands normally transmitted in clear text moved to secure channels. The KGB station in Brussels reported that NATO headquarters had activated crisis procedures. Field agents observed unusual activity at military installations across Western Europe. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The Americans were moving. The first chief directorate of the KGB, responsible for foreign intelligence operations, had been collecting data points for Operation Ryan since May 1981, accumulating thousands of reports from field stations across NATO countries that documented everything from bank withdrawal patterns to the movement of government vehicles, all filtered through an analytical framework designed to detect preparations for nuclear war but fundamentally corrupted by confirmation bias and pressure. From Moscow to report positive findings, station chiefs in London, Bonn, Washington, and other Western capitals understood that their careers and potentially their freedom depended on satisfying the Kremlin's demand for intelligence confirming Western aggressive intentions, creating a feedback loop where analysts in Moscow received information that validated their pre-existing fears, while critical or contradictory assessments were suppressed or diluted as they moved up the chain of command. The cumulative effect of this intelligence collection effort, operating continuously for 2.5 years, by November 1983, had convinced key Soviet decision-makers that the United States was actively planning a surprise nuclear attack, not as a distant theoretical possibility, but as an imminent operational reality that required immediate countermeasures to prevent Soviet strategic forces from being destroyed before they could retaliate. General Secretary Andropov, gravely ill with kidney disease and increasingly paranoid about Western intentions, had created an environment where no one dared to question the fundamental premise of Operation Ryan, and the intelligence apparatus responded by providing exactly the kind of information that confirmed the leadership's darkest suspicions about American plans. The modifications to Able Archer 83, that NATO planners viewed as realistic training enhancements, appeared to Soviet analysts as unmistakable confirmation that the exercise was a cover for actual attack preparations, each deviation from previous exercise patterns matching indicators on the Ryan checklist with disturbing precision. The participation of actual political leadership rather than staff officers fulfilled indicator number 17, which specified that a genuine nuclear strike would require heads of government to be in position to authorize weapon release. The activation of reforger procedures matched indicator number 23, which identified the movement of reinforcements from the United States as a preparatory measure for major conflict. The shift to radio silence and minimize communications protocols aligned with indicator number 31, the reduction of routine traffic before military action. The simulation of nuclear weapon dispersal from storage sites triggered indicator number 42, which Soviet doctrine considered the final step before nuclear release, because weapons could not be launched from centralized storage facilities. The change in NATO authentication procedures matched indicator number 8, the implementation of new security protocols that would prevent Soviet penetration of command networks during actual war. Soviet intelligence officers, trained to weight these indicators and calculate cumulative probability of attack, saw their assessment matrices filling with positive confirmations across multiple categories simultaneously, a pattern that their training and doctrine told them represented the transition from peacetime status to imminent nuclear war. The Soviet military response began within 48 hours of Able Archer's commencement, a series of escalatory actions that reflected genuine fear in Moscow, but appeared to NATO as routine Soviet military activity because Western intelligence had no visibility into the internal Soviet decision-making process and no understanding of how seriously the Kremlin leadership took the threat they perceived. Soviet air forces in East Germany and Poland received orders to increase readiness levels, moving fighter interceptor regiments from routine garrison status to higher alert conditions that would allow them to launch within minutes rather than hours. Nuclear-capable aircraft carrying live weapons rather than training rounds moved to forward airfields, a break from standard exercise protocols that indicated someone in the Soviet command structure believed actual combat might be imminent. Ground forces along the inner German border received ammunition distribution orders, issuing live artillery shells and tank rounds to units that normally trained with inert practice munitions. Soviet submarine activity in the North Atlantic increased as boats that had been in port received sailing orders and deployed to patrol areas where they could strike American and British targets if ordered. Strategic rocket forces, the Soviet equivalent of the American ICBM force, went to heightened alert status, with launch crews occupying their posts for extended periods and undergoing the pre-launch procedures that normally occurred only during major exercises or genuine crises. These movements and status changes happened incrementally, spreading across multiple military districts and service branches without obvious coordination, making it difficult for NATO intelligence to distinguish between routine readiness exercises and genuine preparation for combat. Western intelligence agencies, primarily focused on long-term capabilities assessment, rather than short-term indicators of Soviet intent, detected some of these military movements, but interpreted them through their own analytical frameworks that assumed Soviet rationality and strategic stability. The CIA station in Moscow had limited human intelligence penetration of the Soviet military command structure and relied heavily on signals intelligence and satellite imagery to track Soviet force dispositions, technical collection methods that could identify what forces were moving, but provided little insight into why the movement was occurring or what orders had prompted it. British intelligence, with better human source access in Eastern Europe, reported increased Soviet military activity, but attributed it to routine winter training cycles or responses to the ongoing Able Archer exercise rather than signs of genuine alarm in Moscow. The Defense Intelligence Agency tracked Soviet bomber and submarine deployments, but assessed them as normal operational patterns, noting the increased activity in their daily situation reports without elevating it to crisis status or alerting senior policymakers that something unusual might be happening. NATO headquarters received these intelligence summaries and filed them as routine updates, focused on managing the Able Archer exercise and unaware that their training event had triggered a parallel mobilization on the other side of the Iron Curtain. The fundamental problem was mirror imaging, the tendency of intelligence analysts to assume that adversaries think and operate in ways similar to their own culture and military systems, leading Western analysts to dismiss the possibility that Soviet leadership could genuinely believe NATO would launch a surprise nuclear attack under cover of an exercise because such an action would be politically impossible in Western democratic systems. American and British intelligence officers, operating within military cultures that had clear boundaries between training and combat operations, could not imagine Soviet counterparts interpreting Able Archer as anything other than what it was, a complex and realistic exercise designed to test alliance procedures. Soviet analysts, operating within a military culture where deception and surprise were fundamental principles of warfare, and where the Soviet Union itself had executed major operations under cover of exercises in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, naturally assumed that NATO might do the same. This analytical gap, created by fundamentally different military cultures and operating assumptions, meant that neither side fully understood what the other was thinking, and both sides were operating based on incomplete and distorted pictures of their adversaries' intentions. The situation deteriorated further on November 8th, when NATO exercise controllers decided to make the simulation even more realistic by including scenario inputs that simulated the breakdown of conventional defense and the need to consider nuclear options. Exercise participants received message traffic indicating that Warsaw Pact forces had broken through NATO defenses at multiple points along the inner German border. Simulated tactical nuclear weapons were authorized for release against advancing Soviet armored columns. The exercise scenario escalated to strategic nuclear exchange, with participants simulating the procedures that would occur if the United States and Soviet Union began launching intercontinental ballistic missiles at each other's territories. NATO political leadership, playing their roles in the simulation, went through the decision-making process that would occur in actual war, discussing targeting options and authorization procedures, while military commanders executed the communications protocols that would precede nuclear launch. Soviet signals intelligence intercepted these transmissions, authentication codes never seen before, launch authority messages moving through NATO nuclear command channels, strategic bomber alert orders, ICBM targeting coordinates. The final indicators on the Ryan checklist were lighting up. Moscow faced a decision. Soviet strategic doctrine, developed over decades of Cold War confrontation, specified that the only rational response to confirmed indicators of American nuclear attack was preemptive launch of Soviet forces. Wait for American missiles to arrive meant accepting the destruction of Soviet retaliatory capability. The entire logic of nuclear deterrence depended on the ability to retaliate, and retaliation required surviving the first strike. Soviet missiles needed to launch before American warheads destroyed them in their silos. The window for decision was closing. Minutes, not hours. The Soviet General Staff, operating from their command bunker beneath Moscow, had minutes to decide whether NATO transmissions represented actual nuclear launch orders or continued exercise traffic, a decision complicated by the fact that Soviet doctrine assumed the United States would disguise a real attack as an exercise to achieve maximum surprise. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the General Staff, had spent his entire career preparing for this moment, but the intelligence picture remained ambiguous because NATO communications procedures during Able Archer looked almost identical to what American procedures would look like during actual war. Soviet military doctrine provided clear guidance for this scenario. If indicators suggested imminent American attack, Soviet strategic forces should launch preemptively to ensure survival of retaliatory capability. The doctrine existed because Soviet military planners understood that waiting for confirmation of attack meant waiting for American warheads to destroy Soviet missile silos, command bunkers, and bomber bases, eliminating the ability to retaliate and leaving the Soviet Union defenseless. But executing the doctrine meant starting a nuclear war based on intelligence assessments that might be wrong, killing hundreds of millions of people across both superpowers and their allies because of a misunderstanding. Several factors combined to prevent Soviet preemptive launch during the critical period between November 8th and November 11th, when Able Archer exercise controllers were simulating strategic nuclear exchange and Soviet intelligence was reporting maximum alert indicators. First, Soviet intelligence officers stationed in Western Europe, particularly in Britain and West Germany, reported that they observed no unusual civilian preparations that would accompany actual nuclear war, no evacuations of government officials to secure locations, no emergency blood bank mobilizations, no changes in the status of hospitals or civil defense organizations that Soviet doctrine predicted would occur if Western governments knew nuclear war was imminent. KGB residents in London and Bonn, under pressure to confirm attack preparations, instead filed reports noting the absence of civilian indicators despite the military activity associated with Able Archer, creating a contradiction in the intelligence picture that suggested the military indicators might not mean what Moscow feared. Second, Marshal Ogarkov and other senior Soviet military officers, while deeply concerned about NATO's intentions and convinced that the United States was pursuing strategic superiority, retained enough professional judgment to distinguish between possible threats and certain threats and the intelligence picture during Able Archer, despite numerous concerning indicators, never provided the kind of unambiguous confirmation that would justify launching a preemptive nuclear strike. The third and perhaps most critical factor was timing and the structure of Soviet decision-making authority regarding nuclear weapons, which required explicit authorization from the General Secretary before strategic forces could launch, creating a decision bottleneck that forced Soviet military commanders to seek approval rather than acting autonomously on tactical intelligence. Yuri Andropov, gravely ill and increasingly isolated, received briefings about Able Archer and the concerning intelligence indicators, but apparently declined to authorize preemptive launch, either because he retained enough clarity to recognize the ambiguity in the intelligence picture, or because his illness had progressed to the point where he could not fully process the information and defaulted to inaction. Soviet military officers, trained to respect civilian authority over nuclear weapons and aware of the catastrophic consequences of unauthorized launch, followed established procedures and waited for orders that never came. The combination of contradictory intelligence, professional military caution, and the requirement for civilian authorization created just enough delay and uncertainty to prevent the situation from spiraling into nuclear war during the 4 days when the exercise simulation was at its most intense. Able Archer. 83 concluded on November 11th as scheduled. NATO forces returned to normal peacetime status and exercise participants dispersed back to their regular assignments, completely unaware that Soviet forces had been at heightened alert throughout the exercise, or that Moscow had seriously considered the possibility of preemptive nuclear launch. Soviet military forces gradually returned to routine readiness levels over the following days, and the crisis passed without Western intelligence agencies recognizing that a crisis had occurred. The United States and its NATO allies continued normal operations, focused on other Cold War priorities and ongoing tensions with the Soviet Union over arms control negotiations, intermediate-range nuclear forces deployment in Europe, and regional conflicts in Afghanistan and Central America. The full scope of what happened during Able Archer remained classified and largely unknown for years after the exercise concluded. Soviet leadership, embarrassed by their misinterpretation and unwilling to reveal the depth of their fear to Western intelligence, never publicly acknowledged how seriously they had taken the threat or how close they had come to ordering preemptive launch. NATO governments, focused on maintaining deterrence and alliance cohesion, had no incentive to publicize intelligence suggesting their military exercises had nearly triggered nuclear war. The incident might have remained buried in classified archives indefinitely, except for the defection of Oleg Gordievsky, a senior KGB officer who had been secretly working for British intelligence and who provided detailed information about Operation Ryan and Soviet reactions to Able Archer after his extraction from Moscow in 1985. Gordievsky's debriefings revealed that Soviet leadership had genuinely believed the United States might be preparing nuclear attack. The fear was real. The mobilization had been serious. The danger had been extreme. British intelligence shared the information with the CIA. American analysts, initially skeptical, reviewed classified records of Soviet military activity during November 1983. The patterns matched Gordievsky's account. The Soviets had been terrified. President Reagan, briefed on the findings in 1984, was reportedly shaken by the realization that Soviet leadership had misinterpreted American intentions so completely. His diary entries from this period reflect genuine concern about the dangers of miscalculation and the fragility of deterrence. The nuclear war he had never intended to start had almost begun anyway. The Able Archer intelligence fundamentally altered Ronald Reagan's approach to the Soviet Union, transforming his public rhetoric and private calculations in ways that few observers recognized at the time, but which became clear only when presidential archives were declassified decades later. Reagan, who had entered office in 1981 with confrontational rhetoric designed to challenge Soviet power and reverse what he viewed as American decline, began softening his language and seeking diplomatic engagement almost immediately after receiving the Gordievsky briefings in early 1984. The president, who had called the Soviet Union an evil empire and joked about bombing Russia in a soundcheck, began speaking about the need for dialogue, the dangers of miscalculation, and the shared interest both superpowers had in avoiding nuclear war. His January 1984 speech outlined a new framework for US-Soviet relations, emphasizing communication and mutual understanding rather than confrontation and military superiority. The shift was not merely rhetorical, but reflected a genuine reassessment of Soviet psychology and the realization that Moscow's fears of American attack were real rather than propaganda designed for domestic consumption or international audiences. The key Soviet figures involved in the Able Archer crisis met different fates that reflected the broader political changes occurring within the Soviet Union during the final years of the Cold War. Yuri Andropov, whose paranoia and illness had contributed significantly to the crisis atmosphere, died in February 1984, less than 3 months after Able Archer concluded, never knowing that his intelligence service had misread NATO intentions, or that his caution in refusing to authorize preemptive launch had prevented nuclear war. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, who had maintained professional judgment during the crisis despite enormous pressure, was removed from his position as Chief of the General Staff in September 1984, officially because of disagreements over military doctrine, but possibly because his caution during Able Archer had angered hardliners who believed he should have advocated more forcefully for preemptive action. Oleg Gordievsky, the KGB officer whose defection revealed the truth about Soviet fears, was exfiltrated from Moscow by British intelligence in July 1985 after Soviet counterintelligence identified him as a Western agent, escaping across the Finnish border in a MI6 operation that became one of the most dramatic spy extractions of the Cold War era. He lived the rest of his life in Britain under protection, writing extensively about Soviet intelligence operations and the dangers of the Able Archer period. The incident's long-term impact on superpower relations proved profound despite remaining secret for years, creating momentum for arms control negotiations and crisis communication improvements that helped stabilize the final phase of the Cold War. Reagan and Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, who came to power in March 1985, established direct communication channels and met repeatedly between 1985 and 1988, building personal rapport that helped both leaders overcome hardline opposition within their respective governments to arms reduction agreements. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in December 1987, eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons and included unprecedented verification provisions that allowed each side to inspect the other's military facilities, addressing some of the mutual suspicion that had nearly caused catastrophe 4 years earlier. NATO and Warsaw Pact militaries established direct communication links and agreed to notify each other about major military exercises, creating transparency designed to prevent future Able Archer scenarios where one side's training exercise could be misinterpreted as preparation for war. The lessons of Able Archer influenced military planning and intelligence analysis in both the United States and Soviet Union, forcing recognition that mirror imaging and worst-case assumptions could create self-fulfilling prophecies where fears of attack generated behaviors that made attack seem more likely. NATO revised its exercise protocols to include explicit notifications to Warsaw Pact observers and to avoid realistic simulations of nuclear release procedures that could be misinterpreted by adversary intelligence services monitoring alliance communications. Soviet intelligence agencies, chastened by their misreading of Western intentions, began incorporating more diverse analytical perspectives and challenging assumptions that had driven Operation Ryan. The CIA and other Western intelligence services developed better methods for assessing Soviet leadership psychology and understanding how Moscow interpreted American actions, recognizing that actions intended as defensive or routine might appear threatening when viewed through different cultural and strategic lenses. The closest the world came to nuclear war after the Cuban Missile Crisis happened not because of aggressive intentions or deliberate escalation, but because of misunderstanding, systemic bias, and the absence of communication between adversaries who assumed the worst about each other. Able Archer, 83, demonstrated that nuclear deterrence, for all its theoretical elegance, depended on accurate perception and rational decision-making under extreme pressure, conditions that could not be guaranteed when intelligence systems were corrupted by confirmation bias, and when political leaders on both sides operated with incomplete information about adversary intentions. The exercise that NATO designed to strengthen alliance readiness nearly triggered the war it was supposed to deter. Only a combination of contradictory intelligence, professional military caution, bureaucratic delays, and one Soviet leader's refusal to authorize launch prevented the simulation from becoming reality. The margin between training and catastrophe had been measured in hours, perhaps minutes. The world never knew how close it came.